As we wait for a few more people to join this webinar, could I ask you please, those of you who are there already, to answer this poll. What is your interest in nature-based solutions? To those of you who've just joined, we're just putting a poll up as we start. So if you could just answer this, please. Just answer, what is your interest in nature-based solutions? Excellent, well, thank you. We will share the results of the poll at the end of the session. So let's close this poll now. And I think it's time to get started. So welcome to you all. Welcome to the second session of the City of London Green City Briefings. I'm Audrey Tim. I am Technical Advisor to AIPH, the International Association of Horticultural Producers. We are the world's champion for the power of plants. The City of London Green City Briefings are a series of 8 free of charge 1-hour webinars launched to address climate change topics that the City of London faces and that are relevant to cities worldwide. Together with the Worshipful Company of Gardeners, AIPH prepared the series of briefing sessions with the very welcome support of the City of London. The Worshipful Company of Gardeners has a long tradition of supporting and encouraging greening in London and shows a proven commitment to initiating activities that enable this UK-based livery company to achieve its objectives of promoting the art, the science, and the practice of horticulture. I know many members of this and other livery companies are here in the audience today. Welcome. We have delegates here from more than 40 countries, representing the truly global reach of AIPH and our partner organizations. As a virtual event, there are only a few technical things that I need to mention. You are all on mute and your video is turned off automatically. There is a set time for questions later, and questions will be taken from you, the audience, in writing using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There is no shared chat function today, only the Q&A section. So please put your questions in there and we'll attend to them in the Q&A session. I hope you're all comfortable and have good picture and sound. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Melissa Lee Colbert, Associate Director of the Nature of Cities. Melissa is the social researcher, creative professional, community organizer, writer, and project director dedicated to exploring and better understanding complex urban environments. Melissa co-directs the Nature of Cities, which is an international not-for-profit based in New York, where she works to design collaborative experiences and projects for collaborative action and thought on livability, justice, resilience, and sustainability in cities. Melissa will lead this briefing session, and I hand you over to her now.
Thank you, Audrey, for the introduction. I join Audrey in wishing you all a warm welcome to today's discussion. Today, we'll be talking about water. Water is the most important resource. It supports all life on Earth, but as cities continue to urbanize, and the UN estimates that by 2050, almost 64% of the total population will live in a city, this puts an immense amount of pressure on how water is managed and demands that we consider innovative planning strategies that champion nature-based solutions to tackle these challenges. So this briefing explores how planning that encourages nature-based solutions to water management co-delivers on creating spaces that are part of the city's future as a greener city. And we at the Nature of Cities were delighted to partner on this particular briefing because we work to bring many voices together around the world to reimagine cities that are better for nature and all people. So to kick off this webinar, I'm pleased to introduce our very first speaker, Robert Brears. Robert is the editor-in-chief of the Palgrave Handbook of Climate Resilient Societies and the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Urban and Regional Futures. These are both major reference works published with Springer Nature. He is also the author of a variety of books, including Blue and Green Cities, The Role of Blue-Green Infrastructure in Managing Urban Water Resources, and Nature-Based Solutions to 21st Century Challenges, among many other publications. Robert is also the founder of Our Future Water, which has a knowledge partnership with the World Bank's Connect for Climate program, as well as a partnership with the UN Environment Program, World Bank OECD hosted Green Growth Knowledge Platform. So it's my pleasure to welcome Robert Brears to the webinar.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Let's get this started. Hopefully you can see my presentation. So good afternoon and good morning wherever you are. Today I'll be speaking about greening our grey cities with nature-based solutions. So first of all, I'd like to speak about what we term grey infrastructure. Traditionally, all our cities rely on grey infrastructure to move stormwater as fast as possible from houses, buildings, streets, roads, etc., into the nearest waterway possible to stop localized flooding. And traditionally, these stormwater systems are combined with wastewater sewer systems. These are known as combined systems. All this water usually, traditionally, is then led to a wastewater treatment plant. And then there's treated before discharged into the natural environment. And sometimes this excess water during storms is let out into streams and local waterways, etc. So that's a typical way that most cities around the world operate. And then when you get into new developments, these systems may be separated. You might have a stormwater system separate from the sewer system, but in most cities around the world, these are combined together. And that leads into some major issues. So these combined systems, while they're highly successful, impact water quantity and water quality at the same time. They can be easily overwhelmed during heavy rainfall events, and they increase downstream flooding risks. They also transport excess stormwater into waterways. This exposes people and aquatic life to toxins, chemicals, rubbish, pollutants, everything you can think of, car oil spills, etc., brake fluid, everything you can think of. And that impacts the aquatic life, as well as it poses a health risk to humans. And they completely fail when the heavy rainstorms come and swamp the cities with huge amounts of rain. And you can see a picture here, beautiful, amazing sewer water coming out of the ground. And what these are commonly called, especially in Europe, is called cloud bursts. And these happen in most cities with climate change. Our rainfall is becoming more frequent, more severe, and our traditional grey infrastructure can no longer handle this situation. So you can see this, what they call Copenhagen, the infamous cloud bursts of 2011. The streets are completely flooded out and nothing's working in the city. And Copenhagen was one of the cities that realized with climate change, this is becoming more normal, this is becoming more frequent, so they must do something about it. So today I'm talking about nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions in this context come in various terms. So in my term, the one that's commonly used is blue-green infrastructure. So cities are turning to nature-based solutions to manage water quantity and improve water quality at the same time. And these solutions are commonly termed blue-green infrastructure. Blue-green infrastructure in the UK, it's green infrastructure in North America, it's called water-sensitive urban design in Australia. And I'll be just sticking to blue-green infrastructure today, but they all do the same thing. Basically, these are semi-natural systems or natural systems that are managed in such a way that restores the natural landscape while improving water quality and managing excess water. And blue-green infrastructure come in various shapes and sizes. No size fits all in one city. It could be completely different in another city. They range from rain gardens to green walls, green streets, and urban forests. And combined, they can manage our excess water, they can cleanse the water at the same time, and it's all for free because nature is doing it for you. So a key function a key aspect of blue-green infrastructure is what's called multifunctionality, which means that one blue-green infrastructure site can provide multiple benefits and serve multiple functions all in the same spatial area. For instance, a green wall can reduce stormwater runoff, as well as improve water quality, but also reduce the urban heat island effect, and also insulate the building and provide a habitat for species. For instance, during the warmer months, the green wall can reduce the cooling costs for air conditioning, and during the cooler months, it can reduce heating for keeping you warm inside because the plants are keeping you warm naturally. And they also provide multiple co-benefits. Because of its multifunctionality, one little blue-green infrastructure can provide all these multiple benefits. For instance, it can provide enhanced biodiversity in cities. It can protect your buildings and infrastructure from climate change. It can provide green jobs with people getting training and education and then careers in this area. It can reduce infrastructure costs because grey infrastructure has a higher cost than green infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure. It also provides space for recreational and social activities. And you can see here, BGI comes in so many different shapes and forms. You can see a green roof, you can see the stormwater tree planters, you can see rain gardens on the side of roads. So they come in all different shapes and sizes. And as I said, no one size fits all. So however way your city is built, you can design it around that city and what the people need. But today I'm talking about how can cities actually facilitate the uptake of blue-green infrastructure. And one of the key things of doing so is fiscal tools. So these are financial tools and instruments that cities can use to encourage the uptake of blue-green infrastructure. So as I mentioned, fiscal tools come in many, many different ways. They come in stormwater fees, they come as grants, they come as subsidies, and they encourage the uptake of blue-green infrastructure on private properties as well as public spaces, also new developments and retrofits as well. And they're easy to implement because you can tailor the fiscal instrument to the type of community you're trying to serve or the city itself. And they also provide an opportunity for a city to pilot small things and then see if it takes off and see whether that BGI is actually could become a citywide thing. For instance, you might provide a small council a grant to try out blue-green infrastructure in a specific neighborhood of a city. And if that works, then it can be implemented citywide. So just very, very briefly around the world, we have Berlin here. And what they've done is they've taken the rainwater fee, they've created a fee, and then they've actually increased that fee to encourage businesses to provide BGI on their private premises. The Euro 1.8 sounds very, very small, but when you have a business which has hundreds of square meters of property, these costs add up. This provides an incentive for the business to implement BGI on the private property to reduce their rainwater fee, which is paid annually. Of course, if you have any questions, you need these slides, I'm happy to send them. So if you don't manage to read all of it, that's fine, I can email them to you. And also BGI provides the ability for the company to have a partial or full waiver of the whole fee. And we're looking at the city of Raleigh in North Carolina. What they've created is a rainwater rewards program. This is a reimbursement. So basically a business or organization will implement BGI and they'll be reimbursed up to 90% of those costs for the project itself. And they have all types of projects that are eligible for this: permeable pavements, constructed wetlands, green roofs, etc. And subsidies believe in reimbursement. That means that the person has to put the money down first and then actually make the project happen, and then the city will reimburse for the amount. That takes the risk away of rather having a grant which could lead to a project that fails in the future. But then New York does it that way. They provide the grant, but then how they get around that potential failure is they offer workshops to people to explain how the project, how it can be done, what are the eligibility requirements, and they guide the people through the application. New York has a huge amount of blue-green infrastructure across streets and rainwater gardens. And what they're doing at the moment is they're focusing more on green infrastructure on private properties in context of green roofs. So they basically provide a grant based on how big your green roof will be and how deep it is, which means how much water will it retain during storm events. And then we have a huge range of non-fiscal tools to encourage BGI in private and public property. So basically, cities can use a whole different types of non-fiscal tools to encourage BGI in public and private land, including developments and retrofits. And the common types of tools include information and awareness campaigns. They can even be fast tracking of BGI project applications, which means the city will itself sit down with you, and as long as you've ticked all the boxes, you've done what you have to do, you've sent in the forms, they can fast track that. And that encourages new developments and retrofits to get BGI installed quicker than having to go for a slow regulatory process and meandering through bureaucracy, especially when BGI can involve many different departments of the city. For instance, it could involve transportation, it could involve the city development authorities. And fast tracking means that all government agencies will work together to help the private property owner or public property owner fast track an application. They can also be seen as pilot and demonstration projects. And this means that basically cities will develop a demonstration project to show to the neighborhood or show to the city how effective BGI can be. And that encourages the private sector to then implement BGI. These tools are considered to be quite less intrusive and they create less resistance from stakeholder groups naturally because there's no fees attached to it or charges. And again, they allow cities to test programs and that may one day become mandatory. For instance, you might encourage the uptake of green roofs for a grant program and then say, okay, in 2 years' time, we're going to make this green roofs a mandatory requirement for new developments or retrofits. And it gives time for people to get used to it, installing it and seeing how a project runs, but it gives people a leeway of a few years, for example. And this type of, what San Francisco has done is with their BGI projects, they are always tested against a triple bottom line analysis. So the BGI has to fulfill multiple community, environmental, economic benefits. And one of the especially community benefits is that BGI provides an opportunity for stakeholder engagement, but also training and education and awareness raising. So to really get the community involved in their BGI, they've created what's called the Rain Guardians program. And that helps, that fosters this community spirit where businesses or individuals will look after their rain gardens in their neighborhoods. And that also helps maintain them, and maintenance costs are very, can be quite high in cities. So it's a way of reducing the costs for maintaining BGI because BGI can also become very ineffective if it's left to its own devices. For instance, trash and rubbish and all types of things happen. So the community is actively maintaining it. And what I find very interesting is what Melbourne is doing is that getting people involved and up close with BGI. So, getting people to actually experience it because, maybe you live in a building, you don't have much connection with nature. So what they've done is they've created a movable green wall, and that can be taken across cities and to show people what it's actually like. You can actually touch it, and they take it to different neighborhoods. And this green wall in particular is made of grassland species, and they take it to different parts of the city to expose people to see how it works, the multiple benefits provide. And also they have city representatives on hand to answer questions for people. How does it work? What environment is it suitable for my house or your building, etc. So that's like a demonstration of showing people what it's really, really like. Sometimes demonstrations come in other forms. For instance, city may say, okay, for our city council buildings, we will have green roofs or we'll have rain gardens, or we'll create some type of BGI feature. And that means that people can actually see not only a demonstration of how it works, but also leading by practice, leading by example, which is another non-fiscal tool that cities and city councils can use to really encourage people to think about BGI. And one of the interesting things that we keep hearing often is how to integrate, green infrastructure with grey infrastructure. And Singapore has a very active BGI program. It's called Active, Beautiful, Clean Waters program. And they have, with their green buildings certificates, etc., they have points given for BGI and private property. But what they're doing is also leading by example as well. So they're actively finding ways to incorporate BGI into existing grey infrastructure to manage not only extreme weather events, but also bring people closer to water. So one particular project which has been highlighted as very successful is that undertaking an improvement project of a flood diversion canal. These canals are designed to prevent localized flooding. They're just concrete structures, very boring, flowing through the city. What they've done here is they've taken an 800-metre long stretch of it, and they've installed BGI features. And they've put rain gardens, they've put new shelters, benches, fitness equipment, paths for jogging and cycling. They've created a wetland, and that's designed to bring people closer to the water, experience nature, restore the natural habitat, but also prevent that localized flooding. So overall, in a flying around the world visit in a very short space of time, we can see that BGI allows cities to manage stormwater or improving water quality. And basically, one thing is that BGI cannot be done on its own. It has to become a network of things, and that network that creates that really accentuates that multifunctionality. So multiple green roofs with multiple rain gardens, etc. Well, then the sum is greater than the parts. So basically, it will create huge economic, environmental, and social benefits across the city and for its residents and people. And when it comes to fiscal tools, we can see there's a huge range of fiscal tools available, whether it's stormwater fees and rebates and grants to scale up BGI and private property. Now, we know that, with COVID, et cetera, that the city governments and their budgets are very stretched at the moment. But then what you can do is be very innovative in how you use your fiscal tools by providing grants to communities, to non-profits, to scale up BGI in the neighbourhoods or create new BGI on new developments in schools, etc. To not only manage the stormwater, but also bring people back to nature, restore our cities to the natural environments. And also, when it comes to non-fiscal tools, there's basically, you're looking at ways of engaging people, engaging stakeholders, and also getting them involved in BGI, because as I said before, having people maintain the BGI means they become effective. And by being effective, it means less complaints, and less complaints means more happy neighbourhoods and more people wanting that BGI because they can actually see it working. The last thing you want to do is create a whole lot of BGI in a neighbourhood, have no one maintain it, it fails. People then complain about it because they look horrible, there's rubbish and trash in them, and then they don't work, and then someone thinks, well, this is silly, and just concretes it over. So that is one of the problems. So by thinking about how to engage communities, whether it's by adopting these things or creating rain guarding programs, they're highly important. And also demonstrating the application of BGI. It's highly important that cities and city councils lead by example as well, rather than mandating regulations on you must do this or you must do this. If you actually lead by example, what you can do is then create this nice framework. You can create the grounding for future mandatory regulations, getting people used to this concept, because this is not a mainstream concept yet. The traditional way of thinking is just straight to grey infrastructure. So there's a lot of resistance that needs to be overcome, a lot of barriers. And also another way of resistance is overcoming this barrier of perceiving it to be either grey or green. Whereas what Singapore has done is integrated BGI into the traditional grey infrastructure, as well as having separate grey infrastructure itself. So in that sense, I like to conclude exactly almost 20 minutes. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It's so inspiring to see how nature-based solutions really transform a city to not only mitigate issues like the risk of flooding, as you mentioned, but really to really create these various co-benefits that come along with it that really improve the quality of life in a city. So thank you for the presentation. Our next guest speaker, I'm pleased to welcome James Hitchmough. James Hitchmough is Professor of Horticultural Ecology at the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield. This is one of the largest and most prestigious departments in the UK. He was head of this department from 2014 to 2018. James is best known for his research and practice into how to make and manage ecologically based designed plant communities and how people emotionally respond to this type of vegetation. In the process of doing this, he has become increasingly interested in much broader contexts as well, such as how to renature both urban and rural landscapes to offer richer experiences for people and better habitats to support biodiversity. Importantly, he does not see these commodities as mutually exclusive. James has also worked extensively in practice as well and has concentrated much of his work in China. Over the past decade, he has visited China more than 50 times. He is an advisor to the cities of Beijing and Chengdu and is a passionate advocate for the greater use of local native species in more ecologically responsive projects. Needless to say, he has traveled extensively and has used the knowledge he's gained from these expeditions to study vegetation in the wild to pursue his ecological design agenda. So join me in welcoming James Hitchmough.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. Right, okay, let me just get this to work. Good, okay, I think we're up and running. I hope you can all hear me. Well, thanks very much for listening. So I'd like to talk about reimagining urban landscapes from a water management perspective, and I'm going to start with a sort of broader view of the world and then become more specific and look more at plants and planting at the end of the show, so to speak. So what do I mean by reimagining? Well, these are visualizations, not actually real places, but these are visualizations for a suburb of Copenhagen. And Robert talked about cloudburst in Copenhagen and how it really changed how they saw the world. And this is what you have to understand what you're looking at here. You're looking at an urban park which has been designed to be essentially a flood basin or a stormwater collection point, floodplain, I guess, when you get heavy rain and the water from all the hard surfaces is taking into this. So this is a much more radical view than we typically have at the moment in the UK, where we think it's about putting in a few tens or a few hundred square meters of drainage swales, and so that's it. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to really understand that really isn't going to cut it. And so we need to think about bigger scales. We need to think about this is not like a bolt-on, like a bit of tokenism, but this has to become the new normal and the new everywhere. Otherwise, we simply won't collectively achieve these sorts of goals. So this is some more visualizations by this design company. And here's a sort of multiple use games area, and it's designed simply to fill with water, with stormwater off hard surfaces. Now, of course, so this is the sort of thing we need to be thinking of much, much more. But of course, the problems in doing this, as Robert's already pointed out, is one of the problems we have in the UK is a lot of our sewage systems, they mix drainage water from hard surfaces, and the one in the pink, that's meant to be the red lights. They mix stormwater with wastewater. So you've got a problem. You've got a whole problem of potential fecal contamination, etc. And we have a relatively small percentage of water sewers which only carry water. And this is really the fly in the ointment, if you like. So Copenhagen has only been able to imagine what Copenhagen has done and what it proposes for the future, because it's actually separated out stormwater. So they've now constructed a parallel stormwater system to the sewage. So they're not mixing it anymore. So this means you can take a runoff water from hard surfaces without massive fecal waste contamination, and you can put it into things like parks and other areas where you can allow it to soak in. But I think it's fair to say that the water industry in the UK the water company is only really beginning to bite the bullet on this one. And there are initiatives happening, but at the moment, this issue has not really been resolved. But this is absolutely central to this large-scale approach, as you will see. So I'd just like to try and ground you this in a little bit of practice, a practical application. A lot of these things float above the earth, a little bit like the planning cloud. and doesn't actually touch the earth very, very effectively. This yellow dotted line in the middle of Sheffield, this is a stormwater drainage system which runs for about 1 kilometre, called the Greater Green. And it's the largest type of stormwater urban collector system in the UK, as far as I'm aware. And it's much praised, and it's a fantastic thing. But when you see that's it, and that Sheffield, central Sheffield, you realise it's only really capturing a tiny percentage of the storm water. So the water runs down the hill, it runs across the road, it runs into the swale, it's slowed down, there's some infiltration, there's some water holding, and so on and so forth. It produces, it's a very, very pleasing, designed by Nigel Dunnett and Zach Tudor primarily. It's a fantastic thing, but you need to have these things almost everywhere if they're really going to be effective. And so we need to scale up our thoughts and not just simply see these things as trinkets or tick box that we now have them. Many of the stormwater management things that we have in cities today, are of this nature. So this is Burgess Park. So I designed these. I designed the planting. I didn't design the dimensions of the swales. This is the entrance to Burgess Park, and these swales take all the water off the hard surface at the entrance of the park. And because they're in that situation, they have to look good. So this is just after planting. I suspect they're rather too deep, but you have to ask the engineers about that one. I've never seen them with more than about 200 millimeters of water in them. But you need to get vegetation which can work in the gradient of conditions in these sites. This is the same site a few years later in November. So it's all about trying to get the right plants for the right place. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. So if we're going to adopt this bigger approach, what we really need to do is we need to start thinking much more in terms of cities, in terms of catchments. So this is a project I've been working on in China with the Chengdu government. We developed a sort of a vision for this mountain range to the east of Chengdu called Longquanshan. And what we're now doing is we're working through this, actually looking at trying to hold water in catchments on the mountain so it doesn't run down quickly off the mountain into Chengdu. And that's about 1 kilometre across from left to right. So these mountain complex topography. And what we're doing here, if you look at the blue, we're actually deciding where we're going to have infiltration, swales, collectors fitted into the contours. And you have to think about cities in exactly the same way. Not simply thinking, oh, we've got a street, we've got a swale in the street, and sort of that's the end of it type thing. Now, there are very few landscapes in the UK which were designed with these sorts of ideas in mind. This is one of them. This is the London Olympic Park, and the river corridor. And this is it's not runoff water. This is river flooding type thing. But the river channel is between the orange temporary fencing. And when it floods, this is what the landscape looks like. It's a floodplain, water moves sideways, and the whole of the park was designed to facilitate this to happen. And when it's not flooded, that's the same that's the same place. So without flooding, with flooding. So you can see how these things might actually work. So when we think about cities and we think about this in the real world, what are we going to do? So I live in this suburb of Sheffield. This is the urban area is very much on the top of a ridge. And think of all the water that runs off that area. And so what do you do with that water? How do you prevent it from going down eventually either directly into the river, into the drainage corridors, or into a sewage works and then into a river? And of course, what you can see is there's lots of green spaces dotted around at lower altitudes around this ridge. So obviously one of the things you could do is, we could begin to think about retrofitting this green space in order to actually capture the water from this ridge. But of course, doing that requires a very major change. I mean, you're looking at, reinventing the notion of what, the public park is all about. And that is one of the challenges. And of course, this is all conditional upon the capacity to separate stormwater from sewage water. So there are many difficulties in doing this, but I think in reality, this is what you're really looking at. And ironically, if you look at the corridor of green going off, running in the northeast direction from Crooks Valley Park, Originally, that was the water catchment which held the city's drinking water, and then it was filled in and built on, and now it's a sort of rather sort of, you know, generalized public space, but it's a logical place to think about taking all the water off that hill, none of it going into a drainage system into the river, and it all permeating into these corridors. And that would bring many biodiversity benefits and a lot of interest as well, but it has to be designed appropriately. So one of the things we need to think about is what are the range of options? And of course, there isn't a single vegetation sort of solution to these sorts of things. And what you actually have is you have a quite a complex gradient of possibilities. And that's partly driven by the resources for establishments and management, from low, medium, high, and also public expectations of what things actually look like. And so one extreme, you know, you have what you might call what happens happens. This is where you simply have scrapes in which water runs and it colonizes naturally, and you have very little control of what it looks like. And then you go all the way through to something like the grey to green in the bottom right-hand corner, and you might call these ambassador projects. So these are projects in which, you know, these things are in the city centre, they have to look really good, they have quite high management and maintenance costs compared to the what happens happens. And in between of those, you've got a whole range of options, some of which are more suitable to some situations than to others. So we've got this gradient. So that's one of the things you need to think about. You know, it's not a one size fits all. There's a whole spectrum of possibilities here. And this is what I meant before about this becoming the new normal in this sort of reinvention of how we see vegetation in cities. So if you just create a wetland scrape, this is actually in Western China, but it could be anywhere, except you wouldn't have the lotus if it was anywhere. So the grasses are Phragmites. So whenever you create a scrape into which you then divert drainage water, you're going to get colonization by Phragmites, etc. And it just becomes what it becomes type thing. You don't try to control it. It's a very low cost, but it also means that you can't necessarily always control the aesthetics. So that's at one end of the spectrum. And then we've got a whole range of others, slightly less wet. This is a sort of wet meadow. This is a naturally occurring one, but this is the sort of thing you could do, for example, in those Sheffield parks, you know, if you designed them in the topography in a way to hold water. And then we go through to things which are much more labor intensive. So this is the greater green when it was first planted. This is planting into dry gravel. One of the quirky things about a lot of stormwater management is beginning to happen is, rather than use plants which are really wet tolerant, you use plants which are not very wet tolerant in these ambassador type projects. You plant them into deep gravel, they dry out very quickly, so there's always oxygen. So it means you can use a wide range of plants, and you can use plants which don't collapse when it's not wet. Because one of the challenges of these sorts of projects is if it doesn't rain in the summer, the vegetation can look terrible in some of these schemes. And this is what happened in Copenhagen. There's a lot of problems in the Copenhagen scheme because when they got a few summer droughts, no one really worked that one through. So we're very aware of that in the work we do in Sheffield. We should also be thinking about these on a big scale. We should be thinking about these stormwater catchments as woodland, because woodland in a way, you know, is a very elegant solution to this, and obviously good for biodiversity too. But of course, there's also, you know, we also have, if we're thinking of doing this in conventional parks, and we're just simply looking to hold water, to infiltrate it, and then return it back to, say, the use as some sort of mound turf base. This is some work by Charles Jenks, and this is not done for stormwater management. This is a sculptural sort of meditation on the cosmos, if you like. But you can see how this sort of design could be used to create topography, which would create similar effects, and which might be much easier to retrofit into some urban green space environment. So there's a wide spectrum of how we actually do this. So when you look at strategies for plant use in drainage swales, you know, again, you've got this gradient of sites, from sites which are nearly always wet through to sites which are mostly dry and are only occasionally wet after heavy rain. If you look at the scenario in the UK, you know, we're increasingly moved to a winter rainfall, autumn to spring rainfall, and then with much less common heavy downpours in summer. So that's going to become an increasing pattern in London, for example. And you've got this whole spectrum of, and you need different types of species for these different types of environments. And of course, you know, I spend a lot of time in the natural world, sort of looking at how natural systems function. And, you know, and when you do this, it gives you a very good understanding of when selecting vegetation. If you look at this scene here, for example, you know, this is just mountain forest in western Sichuan in China. And what you can see is, you know, you can see this is in spring, and you can see all of the deciduous species are all associated along the drainage lines, which are the wetter bits. And then on the dry slopes, you know, they're all evergreen species. So at a glance, suddenly, you know, you can see what is occupying the conditions where. And this is really important because understanding what plants, you know, plant conditions plants tolerate in the wild, they are the conditions in evolutionary terms they have evolved to cope with. And this is one of the challenges we have, is we have a rather weak literature in terms of what you can use where, especially once you move away from purely sort of the most common native species in that part of the world that you're dealing with. So because horticulturally, we're much more challenged on a lot of this sort of thing. One of the really interesting things about Sheffield is it has this, you know, it has this series of wetlands. Sheffield has valleys running through in which the rivers were used to create an energy system based on water, in which water drove water mills, and this was used for knife grinding. And what you're looking at here, you're looking at one of the water retention ponds, which were made in the 17th century and now become a sort of older car. And it's an example of how, you know, thinking about those parks down the hill from where I live, how that landscape there might be designed as, say, for example, in this case, wet woodland. So, you know, there were many, you know, if you look around, you can see many examples of how we might use vegetation in ways which was never designed primarily for the sort of water management that we're looking at, but has a parallel sort of function. And this is fantastically good for nature conservation. So when we're looking at, say, woodlands, for example, and we're looking at trees, you know, trees haven't really entered the water management thing to any enormous degree yet. I can think of very few projects around the world where trees have been used as primary elements. Mostly we think of wetlands and herbaceous vegetation. And what this graphic attempts to do is, you know, if you look to the left-hand side of where the plant names are, that then relates to their tolerance of water. So Taxodium disticum, for example, will grow in standing water. And in actual fact, Taxodium disticum works very well on the 5 gorges dams in China, where very often these species, they are submerged up to 5 meters at certain times of the year, and they cope with that perfectly well. And when the drawdown takes place, they become terrestrial again. So Taxodium disticum, Lissus lobatica, these are examples of species which tolerate extreme inundation. And then we move to things like Salix, Populus alders, and these are more permanently wet soils. Metasequoia, Glyptostroboides is another species which is extremely wet. Betula pubescens is a bit less wet. And then eventually you get to species which are more normative, you know, more not really wet species. Species like Quercus roba is more associated with sites which are wet in winter and occasionally wet in summer. And then you move to hypersensitive species in terms of wetness, like Sorbist. So, you know, we need to think about vegetation in these ways, and we need to start developing understanding so we can rank all species in terms of these sort of moisture gradients that you might actually have. And many designers struggle because they don't have sufficient understanding of these issues. And so that makes them very conservative in terms of how they would play this. There's a very interesting paper by Nimetz and Valdaris. That's a really useful resource for any of you So it's a useful starting point on some of this sort of stuff. And one of the really interesting things is that as I said, we often, from a horticultural point of view, we sort of imagine that plants sort of had evolved in a nursery catalogue, and they don't have like a history, an ecological history. But of course, all plants do have ecological histories, and they are shaped by their environments they evolved in. So I just wonder how many the audience to this talk would realize that Magnolia stellata is actually exclusively in the wild in Japan. It's exclusively associated with bogs, swamps, and river margins. It's a wet species. We just see it as a magnolia. But in actual fact, it's one of the few magnolias which is extremely wet tolerant. But again, if you've never been to Japan and seen it in its habitat in Honshu, this is a bit of a mystery. But none of this is reflected in the literature we have available to us. And that's a real challenge for the horticultural world, to begin to develop a more ecologically aware literature. Okay, so also try and keep on time. So in conclusion, so I guess what we need to have in urban areas, we need to have much more of a conurbation or catchment scale approach to urban stormwater management. One of the problems in design practices is that people design these things on a site-by-site basis, and the dots are never really joined up. And so someone has to join the dots up beyond the scale of the site. Otherwise, we're always pushing water up a hill, if you'll forgive the pun. One needs very different types of plant communities for different contexts, so it isn't just one size fits all. The water management literature tends to be dominated by the notion that only native species are appropriate for these things. And of course, that's stronger in some parts of the world than others. And although, as was said in the beginning, I work a lot with native species and are very pro-native species, in many cultural environments, you need to think beyond that, especially if you have a very small native flora, as we do in the UK. Simply that one can't always find native species which got the characteristics you want once you start throwing in things like, can you tolerate being inundated for so many months of the year? So I think we need to think quite more flexibly about that than we sometimes do. And as I've already said, the horticultural literature of what species will tolerate these oscillating wet-dry conditions, is rather rudimentary. And we really do need a bit of a renaissance in terms of a more ecologically based literature. Good, so that's me. Thank you very much. Oh, except, knowledge of plant habitats and ecology is critical. Okay, so that's me done. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. I did not know that about the magnolia. It's a fascinating point. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I'd like to invite James and Robert to join us back on screen so that we can take a few questions. We definitely have more than we can possibly answer today, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I think I'll start with Robert, since those are a few of the questions that came in first. There's a first question here from Charles Sneed, and Charles is wondering, do green walls provide a net benefit given their very high capital and maintenance costs, as well as the enormous amount of water required for irrigation?
These green walls are native species, so they should not require, if any irrigation can come from rainwater harvesting systems on rooftops, etc. So they should. This is not meant to be a green wall that requires high capital costs. These are simple, plants, structures on side of buildings just to, infiltrate, capture as much rainfall as possible, slowing down rainfall, falling onto footpaths below, and doing that job. So any irrigation, there shouldn't be high maintenance costs, because sometimes, these green walls can be simply pot plants put together. So someone just has to take out one plant, put another one in. And also very important, using native species. So you're not requiring huge amounts of irrigation for it in the first place.
Yeah, right. I've seen many green walls, of course, and they all sort of differ in the design, the size, the scale, and as you mentioned, the different plant species that you have, that you've incorporated into them. Then I'll move on to a question that came in a little bit later for James. This question is from Thomas Carolan, and he's asking, based on the context in Ireland, what are people's thoughts on the issue of tackling misconnections? So drainage meant for foul sewers misconnected to storm drains. This is a big issue that he's experienced in urban areas in Ireland. I wonder if you have a comment on that, James.
Well, I can't pretend that I am an expert in misconnections, but I'm very aware of misconnections, and misconnections are a big problem in the UK too, where basically water that was meant, foul water that was meant to go into a foul water sewer goes into the general stormwater, the mixed, these mixed stormwater sewage things. I think the big issue is that we don't have two separate systems. In most cases, it's only typically in Britain, it's only in newer housing, particularly housing post-1970s. And in some cases, separate systems have been put in, but they don't connect up into the street because there isn't a separate system in the street. So it's a huge issue. And I mean, again, it's not an area, it's not my expertise, but what I would say is, I mean, I was reading something the other day looking at some of the initiatives which are happening within the water industry in the UK. And I suspect it's pretty terrifying for the water industry because some of the actual costs associated with how do you resolve these issues at source are pretty massive. And this is something which doesn't get much of a mention, but clearly this is the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm.
Another question then for Robert. I think this is a question from John Edwards, and I think he was referring to some of the nature-based solutions that you'd mentioned in your presentation. Any examples of multi-use footway surfaces that are permeable and low impact, so facilitating aerobic exercise, running or brisk walking?
There's lots of different types of permeable pavements, these interlocking pavements, all these different types of things for recreational use. The only thing they tell, the best practice is to avoid these surfaces for heavy vehicle traffic. So a lot of places are doing this where they're creating these nice pathways for people to, be able to walk, cycle and jog along, and then also storing stormwater and runoff and infiltrating into soil below. So this is becoming really popular, and it's just like restoring the environment back to its natural look instead of paved concrete pathways everywhere. So there's in examples, or I mentioned the Singapore one, you're seeing that in cities like, I think Amsterdam, they're tearing up, they have, actually it's called like basically removing the pavements and streets almost. They have these concepts now where people are encouraged to create these nice spaces where people can walk and, have natural environments. But definitely the example I gave in North Carolina, actual providing grants, reimbursements for this installation, these are becoming really popular in many cities. There's quite a few to list, but definitely Singapore is doing that.
Great. And this is a question that's coming from Dana Burstow, and I think maybe it relates to both of your presentations. So she's asking, are there any countries which have restricted building on private backyards or front gardens to preserve green infrastructure? So for example, restricting astroturf, erecting outbuildings, block paving driveways, and that sort of thing. She's noticed that this seems to be increasing in London, and perhaps other people have noticed this in other cities. So are there examples of countries where they've sort of restricted this type of building?
Definitely. In Oslo and Malmö in Sweden, Berlin, etc., they all have like green factors where you are only allowed to build on certain parts of your property. The rest must be maintained for trees or shrubs and greenery. That's very common in continental Europe, definitely, and slowly coming out to other countries, in my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly in London there was an issue. I don't know where it went, but as far as I'm aware, there is planning requirement in London. It's you have to get planning permission to tarmac over or pave over your front yard. But of course, I don't think that's actually happened anywhere else in the UK. So again, often the picture is very fragmented, and it's a question of getting a more sort of this happening more widely in more cities type thing. Mm-hmm. Similarly, in Sheffield, for example, a few years ago, we had a new planning code was developed based on the work at the university I work at that all buildings beyond a certain size, and basically commercial buildings, had to have a green roof as a mandatory treatment. But that was dumped as soon as the recession hit. And people were worried about not actually, people no longer wishing to invest in the city. So it's sometimes very difficult to actually maintain these things when you hit economic pressures. And so that's a real life challenge.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also have a follow-up question just actually on that point of the front gardens and the sort of back lawns. There's a really big rewilding trend that exists in where I am in Canada, but I know this is in a number of other places as well, where, so we've talked about sort of the design and how you can include intentionally these native plant species, but then there's also this sort of other side where a lot of people are using their lawns so to avoid sort of just the grass and that typical traditional lawn, but to really just let the native plant species that would grow just to do their thing essentially where they would. And there's the debate sort of ranges between people saying these yards look messy within the city and we should tailor them, and then there are others that are saying, well, you know, it's beautiful actually just to let the variety of species that exist in that space be. So I was wondering what both of you think about those things.
Who wants to go
I've seen
first,
this kind of argument. Yeah.
You go ahead, Robert.
All right, it's just like, I guess it's like the location you're in, you have to plant to those conditions. You know, it's no point living in the driest part of the country and then watering your grass so it's beautiful and green like a golf course. So it's like education and raising awareness on different types of plant species, and also getting people used to maybe not, it's not always going to look beautiful and it's going to look a little bit messy, but that's nature for you. So it's all about education, and probably more in schools, getting it into young people's minds. To think this is normal, because we think, grass and green grass and white picket fences is normal, but then in 20 years time that might not be normal for the next generation. So it's about education, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, clearly, I mean, gardens can play a very significant role in this. I mean, about 20 to 25% of most Northern Hemisphere cities, certainly in Western Europe, are gardens. So it's just about the largest surface area, much larger than public space generally. And so they can play a significant role. And I think the critical thing is to just simply avoid hard surfaces as much as possible, and to avoid surfaces like compacted grass as much as possible, which tend to cause more runoff. But I don't think it's a native, non-native thing. It's just about being a bit more relaxed about how the world is. And I think it's really important not to polarize people, to see my garden has some natives, but mostly it's not natives. But it's very species diverse, and it's very good for water infiltration and very good for biodiversity. It's important not to polarize people into camps of good and bad when there's no underlying basis for that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. It is this sort of focus on increasing the biodiversity that's there. So wild or non-wild species, it does increase biodiversity to have as many as possible. There's another question that came in for you, James, from Mark Bell. Does there need to be a parallel review of fear of water? So the perceived risk of standing water. Too many times the safety around standing becomes overt. So fences, signage, life rings, etc. What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the things we're talking about, we're not really talking about necessarily permanent standing water. In many cases, you're talking about holding water to it infiltrate into the ground. And that's also in a way gets you off the hook. One of the other questions I saw in the chat was in China about people's fear about mosquitoes. And when you work in China, people have very major fears about mosquitoes. And if you don't have standing bodies of water, then obviously you tend to get much lower risks from those things. So I think we should be thinking more in terms of perhaps wet soil, and sometimes wet soil to dry soil, but it's much more difficult to maintain standing waters, and then you don't have to worry about the people drowning, or it's not a major concern because it's a transient thing.
Okay, thank you. So we are just about 1 minute to time. So unfortunately, we don't have any more time to answer the rest of the questions. But I thank you all for joining us. And I especially thank Robert Brears and James Hitchmough for joining us and delivering those great presentations. And it was a pleasure to be here with you all today. And I look forward to the next series in the webinar series. So Audrey, I turn this over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Melissa. That was really good, and thanks for great questions there. Thanks for the audience for bringing in all the lovely questions, really interesting. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all of them, but certainly some of them give us food for thought for doing articles and follow-up sessions, so thank you for that. So I hope you found it interesting. I hope it stimulated your ambition to make a difference and championing the power of plants. So this series of briefings is only one of the activities in the AIPH Green City Initiative. Using knowledge exchange, advocacy and networking, AIPH strives to create an enabling environment to shape and nurture a strategic shift in city governance and planning. We recently launched a new initiative, the inaugural World Green City Awards. These celebrate the commitment, innovation and achievement of city leaders around the world. And cities, through the awards, cities are invited to enter the awards to gain recognition for their initiatives that rely on the greater use of plants and nature to create better city environments. And this helps to fulfill local aspirations for improved economic, social, and environmental resilience. Some of that was touched on today. The awards are offered in 6 categories, one of which is using living green for the protection and use of water resources, very topical for today's session. The other categories are health and well-being, biodiversity, climate change, economic recovery and inclusive growth, and social cohesion. More details are on the AIPH website, and you can register an expression of interest to open a conversation with us to find out even more. We urge cities around the world to enter. So again, thank you for joining this session. So to capture your thoughts from previously, could we see the answers to the first poll, just to get an idea of what sort of people that we have here? So quite an interesting mix, probably slightly more of horticulture design, landscape architecture, general interest, very strong. So thank you very much for that. Very interesting to know what your interest is. Close that, and just before you leave, we'll just do a second poll, which is asking a question from a more general purpose. What is your involvement in addressing climate change? So if I'll give you a couple of minutes just to answer that. These Green City briefings look at addressing climate change, looking at how plants can interact and intersect with the built environment to provide solutions to climate change. So a couple more minutes on the poll. And I think we'll close that, and we'll provide that as a report follow-up from this briefing session. So I look forward to welcoming you again to the 3rd session. This is on the 15th of June and looks at green roofs and walls, the extra-dimensional approach to city greening. Our speakers for the 3rd session are Dusty Gedge, President of the Federation of European Green Roofs and Walls, and Kelvin Can, who is Principal Architect and Facade Consultant from Singapore. And this 3rd session on green roofs and walls follows shortly after World Green Roof Day on 6th of June, so a good celebration of that. Hope you enjoyed today, and until the next session, farewell.